The tomato may be the most successful immigrant in food history because a fruit once unknown outside the Americas now feels native almost everywhere on Earth. That is a huge change, and it did not happen by accident because conquest, trade, science, industry, and taste all pushed this crop across the world. The tomato began as a wild plant in western South America, especially the Andean zone tied to present-day Peru and Ecuador. Those early wild forms were small and very different from the large cultivated tomatoes stacked today in supermarkets and markets. Over time, people selected for size, shape, color, flavor, and growth habit, slowly turning a wild berry into many useful food forms. Researchers think that early domestication likely began in the Andean region, but the crop's full food transformation probably depended heavily on Mesoamerica. That is why the tomato has a two-stage story. Andean origin first, then deeper culinary shaping farther north, especially in Mexico. Archaeological evidence is incomplete, so not every step is perfectly known. Yet by the time Europeans arrived, tomatoes were already known in the Americas. Even the word tomato carries that older story, because it comes from Nahuatl, often traced to the word tomatal. A surviving indigenous name matters because global food history often travels not only through seeds but also through words, recipes, and local knowledge. Then the 16th century changed everything, because Spanish conquest linked the Americas to Europe through the Columbian Exchange. That exchange moved plants, animals, microbes, and people across oceans, transforming agriculture more deeply than many wars ever did. Tomatoes traveled with that wave alongside maize, potatoes, chili peppers, cassava, and cacao, all of which changed distant diets. The tomato likely reached Spain first, then spread through Mediterranean trade routes into Italy and other parts of Europe. At first, however, many Europeans treated it more as a curiosity than as a trusted staple food. Part of the suspicion came from botany, because tomatoes belong to the nightshade family, and some members of that family really are toxic. That fear was real in some places, though it should not be exaggerated into a story where all Europe totally banned tomatoes. Adoption was slow for more than one reason: unfamiliarity, older medical ideas about diet, social habits, climate, and simple caution about new plants. A popular story says rich Europeans were poisoned because acidic tomatoes pulled lead from pewter plates, but historians treat that explanation carefully. It may have happened in some cases, yet it cannot fully explain why acceptance was slow across many different regions and classes. The bigger point is that imported crops do not become daily food overnight, even when they later seem obvious and essential. Tomatoes appeared in herbals and gardens fairly early, but moving from ornament and medicine into normal cooking took more time. In parts of Italy, Spain, and the wider Mediterranean, cooks gradually learned how tomatoes worked in sauces, stews, and mixed dishes. By the 17th and 18th centuries, tomato use had become more established in parts of southern Europe, though not equally everywhere. Italy later became the tomato's most famous adopted home, but that famous bond was historical, not ancient or automatic. Pasta existed in Europe long before tomatoes arrived, which means classic tomato pasta is a later fusion, not an eternal original pairing. The same goes for pizza with tomato topping, which became strongly tied to Naples in the 18th and 19th centuries before spreading globally. Tomatoes won cooks over because their acidity, sweetness, umami, and softness worked beautifully with olive oil, garlic, onion, herbs, beans, grains, and fish. Once people learned how to use them, tomatoes became hard to replace because they added color, brightness, body, and depth at the same time. From Europe, tomatoes spread across the Mediterranean, the Ottoman world, Africa, and much of Asia through trade, empire, and migration. That spread changed cuisine so deeply that many modern dishes now feel impossible to imagine without tomatoes in them. Think of Italian sauces, Spanish gazpacho, pan con tomate, Turkish dishes, Levantine salads and stews, North African cooking, and Balkan meals. Then add South Asian curries and chutneys, Middle Eastern breakfast dishes, Latin American salsas, and East Asian dishes like tomato egg stir-fry. The tomato success came partly from culture, but biology mattered too, because the plant proved surprisingly adaptable to many growing systems. It can grow in home gardens, open fields, greenhouses, hydroponic setups, and protected farming systems that reduce weather stress. Breeders develop different varieties for slicing, sauce, paste, shipping, machine harvest, drying, canning, and the small cherry tomato snack market. That flexibility let tomatoes become both a local garden crop and a fully industrial commodity, which is a rare and powerful combination. Fresh tomatoes alone would never have changed the whole world this deeply, because fresh fruit is seasonal, fragile, and highly perishable. The real revolution grew when preservation improved through canning, bottling, paste concentration, drying, and later cold chain transport. Once tomatoes could be stored, shipped, and processed cheaply, they stopped being only a local harvest and became a global ingredient machine. Canned tomatoes, tomato paste, ketchup, soup, juice, and factory-made sauces turned one crop into a pillar of modern food manufacturing. Ketchup itself changed over time, growing out of earlier sauce traditions before becoming strongly tomato-based, especially in the United States. By the 20th century, tomatoes were everywhere, from home kitchens to military supply systems to restaurant chains and frozen convenience meals. Pizza sauce, pasta sauce, canned soup, fast food condiments, and packaged snacks all drew on tomato processing in ways earlier societies never imagined. The crop also became important to science, because tomato breeding revealed how humans shape plants through selection and genetic bottlenecks. When breeders favored shelf life, firmness, uniform color, crack resistance, and transportability, flavor sometimes lost the contest. That trade-off helps explain why heirloom tomatoes later became symbols of rescue from industrial blandness and oversimplified breeding goals. Tomatoes also became a model organism in plant science, used to study ripening, hormones, domestication genes, and disease interactions. The flavor-savoir tomato entered that story in the 1990s as one of the first genetically engineered foods sold commercially. That made tomatoes central not only to farming and cooking, but also to public arguments about biotechnology, regulation, and consumer trust. Nutrition added another layer to the crop's fame because tomatoes contain vitamin C, potassium, folate, and carotenoids like lycopene. Lycopene gives the red color, and processing tomatoes with fat can sometimes increase the body's ability to use that compound. Still, nutrition alone did not make tomatoes global stars. Flavor, versatility, and convenience did at least as much work. Culturally, the tomato pulled off something remarkable by becoming naturalized in places where it did not exist before the 16th century. People eating shakshuka, salsa, butter chicken, or bolognese rarely stopped to think that none of those tomato elements were always there. That fact exposes a bigger truth about cuisine. National food is usually historical construction, not timeless purity. Empires, migration, labor, trade, and climate leave fingerprints on every plate, and the tomato is one of the clearest examples. Economically, the scale is enormous because world tomato production in the early 21st century was roughly around 180 to 90 million metric tons. China has generally led production by a wide margin, with countries like India, Turkey, and the United States also ranking among major producers. Fresh market tomatoes and processing tomatoes do not always grow in the same places because factories and mechanized farming shape their geography differently. The crop supports seed firms, fertilizer companies, greenhouse businesses, transport networks, supermarkets, food service chains, and giant processing plants. Tomatoes also depend on large labor systems, including seasonal and migrant workers whose conditions are not always fair or well protected. That is one reason the tomato has a darker side, because industrial farming can bring heavy water use, chemical dependence, and labor exploitation. Climate change adds even more pressure through heat, drought, salinity, pests, and diseases that threaten yield and fruit quality. Another long-term worry is biodiversity, because a crop this important becomes vulnerable if commercial breeding grows too narrow. Heirloom preservation, seed banks, and wild relative research matter because tomorrow's disease resistance may come from traits markets ignore today. So why did the tomato change the world more than so many other crops that also crossed oceans in the Columbian Exchange? It crossed several boundaries at once: fruit and vegetable, fresh and processed, local and industrial, humble and elite, health food and comfort food. It gave cooks acidity, color, sweetness, and umami in one package, while also fitting mass preservation and factory production. That rare mix let tomatoes move from village gardens to global logistics systems without losing their everyday appeal. A home cook can slice a fresh tomato for a sandwich, while a factory can turn truckloads of the same crop into paste, soup, or ketchup. That double life is unusual because many crops are either best fresh or best processed, while tomatoes became stars in both worlds. The same plant can sit in gazpacho in Spain, pasta sauce in Italy, shakshuka in the Middle East, and curry in South Asia. That range gave the tomato a passport into many food traditions without asking cooks to rebuild the whole meal around it. Industry pushed the story even farther, because canned tomatoes and tomato paste made the taste available far beyond harvest season. Once storage improved, cities could depend on tomato flavor all year, and restaurants could standardize sauces on a huge scale. Military supply systems, frozen meals, fast food chains, and packaged snacks all benefited from a crop that could be preserved and moved cheaply. Science then kept reshaping the tomato, as breeders searched for firmness, disease resistance, machine harvest, and longer shelf life. That helped trade and transport, but it also created the modern complaint that some supermarket tomatoes look perfect and taste weak. Heirloom varieties became popular partly because they reminded people that breeding for shipping is not the same as breeding for flavor. The crop's scientific fame also grew because researchers used tomatoes to study ripening, hormones, and the genes behind domestication. The flavor-savoir moment in the 1990s pushed the tomato into biotechnology debates, showing that this fruit could even shape public arguments about science. Economic success brought dependence too, because whole labor systems, greenhouse industries, factories, and transport chains now rely on tomato harvests. That dependence is why drought, heat, salinity, pests, and plant disease are not just farm problems but food system problems. Water use, chemical inputs, and labor exploitation also remind us that a global staple can create costs far from the dinner table. Seed banks, heirloom preservation, and research on wild relatives matter because future resilience may come from traits industrial markets once ignored. The tomato also changed color expectations because breeders selected for visual uniformity that made fruit easier to sell across large markets. It changed harvest methods because machine-friendly varieties let processors handle huge volumes that hand-picked systems could not match. It changed shopping habits because canned tomatoes and bottled sauces let people cook outside local growing seasons. It changed restaurant culture because standardized sauce made pizza, pasta, and many fast casual dishes easier to scale from one city to another. It changed home kitchens because one can of tomatoes could become soup, stew, sauce, or braise with very little extra cost. It changed farming landscapes because some regions specialized in fresh market fruit while others specialized in processing factories and mechanized fields. It changed trade routes because preserved tomato products could travel much farther than delicate fresh fruit without spoiling. It changed taste memory because generations grew up thinking red tomato flavor belonged naturally inside foods that were once made without it. It changed cultural identity because dishes now marketed as ancient national classics often depend on a crop that crossed the Atlantic only after conquest. It changed science policy because arguments over genetically engineered food used tomatoes as one of the first public test cases. It changed economic vulnerability because when a crop becomes this central, climate shocks and disease outbreaks ripple through jobs, prices, and factories. It changed preservation culture because drying, bottling, and canning turned a seasonal fruit into a year-round building block of modern diets. It changed breakfast plates, lunch counters, and dinner tables in ways so complete that many people now confuse history with timeless tradition. It changed food memory so deeply that a tomato-less version of pizza sauce, shakshuka, salsa, or bolognese now feels almost impossible to imagine. It changed the meaning of local cuisine because a new world fruit became naturalized inside Mediterranean, Middle Eastern, South Asian, and global industrial cooking. It changed what farmers breed for, what factories can mass produce, and what consumers expect red sauce to taste like all year. It changed how nations imagine their own food past, because a crop carried by empire now feels older than the empire that moved it. It changed the global table so fully that one of the clearest signs of modern food history is simply how many meals begin with tomato. It also changed expectations of flavor itself, because bright red acidity became a normal baseline in kitchens that once cooked without it. The tomato's journey from Andean wild plant to worldwide staple is therefore not a side story hidden in recipe books. It is a map of conquest, adaptation, science, labor, taste, and identity written in red sauce across the modern world. If you want the next food revolution story, watch the video on the Columbian Exchange, because the tomato only makes full sense inside that giant global swap.